They got used to a version of you that stayed quiet, that chose peace over confrontation, that walked away instead of arguing back. And over time, that silence began to define how they saw you. They believed it meant you had nothing to say, nothing to defend, nothing to stand on. But what they failed to understand is that silence is not always empty. Sometimes it is full, full of thoughts, full of awareness, full of decisions being made without a single word spoken. You were never unaware. You saw everything. You noticed the tone shifts, the subtle disrespect, the moments when your kindness was taken for granted. You recognized when your presence was valued less and your boundaries were quietly crossed. But instead of reacting instantly, instead of creating noise, you chose to observe. And in that observation, you began to understand people more clearly than they ever understood you. There's a certain danger in being underestimated. People stop being careful. They reveal their true nature without hesitation. They assume you will tolerate what you've always tolerated. They assume your limits don't exist because they've never seen them, and that assumption becomes their comfort zone. They grow bold in ways they wouldn't dare if they truly understood your depth. But your silence was never surrender. It was strategy. It was protection. It was growth happening in real time, away from their expectations. While they were forming opinions about you based on what you didn't say, you were forming a new version of yourself based on what you finally understood. You were learning where to draw the line, when to step back, and most importantly, who deserved access to your energy. What they saw as passivity was actually control. It takes strength to hold back when you could easily react. It takes awareness to choose your battles instead of fighting every single one. And it takes a certain level of self-respect to remain calm when others try to provoke you into becoming someone you are not. You refuse to give them that power. And now the shift begins, because silence doesn't last forever. There comes a point where growth demands expression, where understanding turns into action. The difference is, when you finally speak or act, it won't come from emotion alone. It will come from clarity, from certainty, from a place that has already moved beyond confusion and doubt. That's the moment they won't be prepared for. Not because you changed suddenly, but because they never paid attention to who you were becoming. They were too focused on who you used to be. They got comfortable with your quiet nature, never realizing that within that quietness, something stronger was being built. And when that strength finally reveals itself, it won't need to be loud to be powerful. It will be felt in your presence, in your decisions, in the way you no longer accept what once felt normal. That same silence they once misunderstood will now carry a different meaning, one they can no longer ignore, and one they will never fully control again. There comes a moment in every person's life when endurance quietly reaches its edge. It doesn't happen all at once, and it rarely announces itself. It builds slowly, through repeated disappointments, overlooked feelings, and the constant pressure of tolerating what never felt right. You didn't wake up one day and decide everything had to change. It was a process, a gradual realization that something inside you could no longer carry the same weight. For a long time, you tried to make it work. You adjusted your expectations, gave people the benefit of the doubt, and convinced yourself that things would improve if you just stayed patient a little longer. You told yourself that understanding others was more important than being understood, and maybe at first it felt like the right thing to do. But over time, that patience started to feel like a burden rather than a strength. The truth is, people often don't notice the pressure you're under when you carry it quietly. They don't see the internal conversations, the moments of doubt, or the effort it takes to keep showing up with the same calm energy. From the outside, it looks like you're handling everything just fine, and because of that, they assume you always will. They don't realize that every unspoken feeling, every overlooked boundary, adds up. What they never saw was how close you were to your limit. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a deeply personal, decisive way. It wasn't about losing control, it was about finally gaining it. There's a difference between reacting emotionally and reaching a point of clarity. And when you reached yours, it didn't come with chaos. It came with a quiet certainty that something had to change. That shift is powerful because it doesn't seek permission. It doesn't wait for others to understand or agree. It simply decides. You stopped negotiating with things that drained you. You stopped explaining yourself to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. And most importantly, you stopped betraying your own needs just to maintain a sense of peace that was never truly there. To others, it might seem sudden. They might question what changed, why you're no longer as flexible, as available, or as willing to tolerate what you once did. But what feels sudden to them has been building inside you for a long time. They weren't paying attention to the small signs, the pauses in your responses, the distance in your energy, the way you began choosing yourself in subtle ways. Reaching that point is not a weakness, it's not failure, it's a form of awakening. It means you finally recognized your own limits and respected them enough to act. And that kind of realization changes everything, because once you see clearly, you cannot go back to pretending things are fine. Now your actions come from a different place, not from frustration, not from the need to prove anything, but from a grounded sense of self-respect. You no longer feel the need to tolerate what diminishes you, and you no longer feel guilty for choosing distance over discomfort. That internal line you drew is no longer invisible. It's real and it's firm. And the most powerful part is this: you didn't need a dramatic moment to justify it. You didn't need validation. You simply reached a point where staying the same was no longer an option. And once that realization settled in, everything else followed, quietly but permanently. Most people only pay attention to what is visible. They notice the outcomes, the results, the moments when something finally surfaces. But what they don't see is the long, quiet process that happens behind the scenes, the part where real change is built. While others were forming opinions about you based on your past, you were doing something far more important. You were stepping back, taking a hard look at your life, and deciding that something needed to be different. It wasn't easy. Growth rarely is. There were moments of doubt, moments where you questioned yourself, where you wondered if you were overthinking or expecting too much. There were nights when everything felt heavy, when the silence around you forced you to confront things you had been avoiding for a long time. But instead of running from it, you stayed with it. You allowed yourself to feel, to reflect, to understand. That's where the real shift began. Not in public, not with announcements, but in private decisions no one else knew about. You started setting small boundaries, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. You began choosing your time and energy more carefully. You paid attention to what drained you and what gave you strength. And slowly, without needing anyone's approval, you began to rebuild yourself piece by piece. The powerful thing about this kind of growth is that it doesn't seek attention. You didn't feel the need to explain every step or prove that you were changing. You understood that not everyone needs to be part of your process. Some journeys are meant to be walked alone, in silence, where the only voice that matters is your own. And in that silence, you found clarity. While others were busy with distractions, you were becoming more disciplined. You were learning how to control your reactions, how to think before you respond, how to walk away from situations that once pulled you in. You started to understand that strength isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to do better, even when no one is watching. There's also a certain kind of honesty that comes with rebuilding yourself. You can't hide from your own patterns. You begin to recognize where you gave too much, where you stayed too long, where you ignored your own instincts. And instead of blaming others for everything, you took responsibility for your own growth. That's not easy, but it's what makes the change real. What makes this transformation even more powerful is that it happened without validation. No applause, no recognition, no reassurance from others. Just you, doing the work because you knew you deserved better. Not from others, but from yourself. And that kind of self-driven change builds a foundation that no one can shake. Now, when people look at you, they may notice something different. They may not be able to explain it, but they can feel it. There's a calmness, a confidence, a sense of control that wasn't there before. What they don't realize is that this version of you wasn't created overnight. It was built in moments they never saw, through choices they never noticed. And that's the difference, because when something is built in silence, it doesn't break easily. It doesn't depend on others to survive. It stands on its own, strong and steady, and by the time the world finally notices, the work is already done. There was a time when everything affected you deeply. Every word, every tone, every shift in someone's behavior had the power to disturb your peace. You felt things intensely, and because of that, you reacted, sometimes immediately, sometimes internally, but always with a sense that you had to respond, had to fix, had to understand. It was exhausting, even if you didn't fully admit it at the time. But something began to change. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started understanding. You realized that not everything deserves your emotional investment. Not every situation requires your energy. And more importantly, not every person values what you give. That awareness didn't make you cold. It made you conscious. You began to notice patterns, the same behaviors, the same cycles, the same outcomes. And for the first time, instead of trying to correct them or take responsibility for them, you stepped back. You observed without absorbing. You listened without immediately reacting. And in doing so, you created space between what happens around you and how it affects you. That space is where your strength started to grow. It's not easy to reach that point. Letting go of the need to respond can feel unnatural at first. There's a part of you that wants to explain, to defend, to make things clear. But you slowly realized that constant explanation doesn't always lead to understanding. Sometimes it only drains you further, and the more you tried to be heard by people who weren't really listening, the more you lost touch with your own sense of balance. So you made a different choice. You chose to protect your peace instead of proving your point. This doesn't mean you became indifferent. It means you became selective. You started asking yourself simple but powerful questions. Is this worth my energy? Does this deserve my attention? And if the answer was no, you allowed yourself to step away, without guilt, without overthinking, without feeling the need to justify it. There's a quiet confidence that comes with this shift. You no longer feel pulled into every situation. You're not easily provoked, not easily shaken. Your calmness becomes your response, and that calmness can be misunderstood by those who are used to getting a reaction from you. They may think you've changed in a negative way, but in reality, you've just stopped giving them access to parts of you they never respected. You also began to understand that your energy is limited. Where you place it matters. Constantly engaging in negativity, drama, or unnecessary conflict only takes away from the things that truly deserve your focus, your growth, your goals, your well-being. And once you see that clearly, it becomes easier to let go of what no longer aligns with you. What's powerful about this transformation is that it doesn't need to be announced. It shows in your actions, in your silence, in the way you carry yourself. You don't have to tell people you're protecting your peace. They feel it in the way you no longer react the way you used to. And that's when everything shifts. Because when you stop feeding into what once drained you, those situations lose their hold on you. They no longer control your mood, your thoughts, or your direction. You become steady, grounded, and far more in control than you've ever been. In the end, it's not about shutting yourself off from the world. It's about choosing how you show up in it. It's about understanding that your peace is valuable, and once you truly realize that, you stop giving it away so easily. At some point, everything changes in a way that doesn't need to be announced. There's no dramatic reveal, no loud declaration. It's subtle, almost quiet, but undeniable. The way you carry yourself shifts, the way you respond, the way you think, the way you move through situations. It all begins to reflect a version of you that others have never seen before. People who thought they knew you start to feel uncertain, not because you've become someone fake or distant, but because you've become someone they never took the time to understand. They were familiar with your past reactions, your old patterns, your predictable ways of handling things. But now those patterns are gone, and without them, they don't quite know how to read you anymore. This isn't about proving anything to anyone. In fact, that need has quietly disappeared. You're no longer driven by the desire to be understood, validated, or accepted by people who once overlooked your worth. Instead, you've built something far more stable within yourself, a sense of certainty that doesn't rely on outside opinions. There's a calmness in you now, not the kind that comes from avoiding problems, but the kind that comes from understanding them deeply and choosing not to be consumed by them. You don't feel the need to react instantly. You don't feel the urge to explain every decision. You simply act in alignment with what you've learned, and you let that be enough. What makes this shift powerful is that it's consistent. It's not a temporary phase or a reaction to a specific moment. It's a result of everything you've been through, everything you've reflected on, and everything you've decided to change. It's built on real experiences, real realizations, and real growth. And because of that, it's not something that can easily be shaken or undone. Others may try to reconnect with the version of you they were comfortable with. They may expect the same responses, the same availability, the same tolerance, but they'll find that those doors no longer open the way they used to. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. You've learned that going back to what once drained you is no longer an option. And the most interesting part is, you don't need to explain this to anyone. Your actions make it clear. The way you set boundaries, the way you walk away from what doesn't serve you, the way you remain steady even when things around you are uncertain, it all speaks for itself. There's a quiet authority in that, a kind of presence that doesn't demand attention but naturally commands it. Some people will admire this change, others may feel uncomfortable with it, and some may even question it, but none of that really matters anymore because this transformation was never about them. It was about you reaching a point where you finally chose yourself without hesitation. And once you reach that point, there's no going back. You don't shrink to fit old expectations. You don't adjust yourself to maintain old dynamics. You move forward as you are now, clear, grounded, and fully aware of your worth. In the end, what surprises people the most isn't just that you changed, it's how completely you did. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that makes them realize they were holding on to a version of you that no longer exists. And the person standing in front of them now is someone they never truly expected.